5,
I really like numpty, and that's basically the entire cabinet.
4,
Labour government, leave our kids alone.
3,
We have a national emergency in immigration.
2,
An absolutely basic Stone Age principle of taxation is that you tax demerit goods and you don't tax merit goods.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson
Hello.
and me, Liam Halligan. High immigration is doing, quotes, serious, unsustainable damage to the UK's public finances. Not my words, co-pilot, but the verdict of Professor David Miles, a senior official at the Office for Budget Responsibility, the government's official fiscal watchdog. With net legal migration averaging 500,000 over each of the last 8 years, an annual population increase equal to Sheffield, our fifth biggest city, and illegal small boat migrants sparking protests at so-called asylum hotels countrywide, establishment analysts are finally acknowledging what has long been obvious. Yes to a reasonable flow of highly skilled, creative, hard-working migrants. The net figure was 50,000 as recently as the late 90s, and largely comprised those willing to speak English and broadly assimilate. Very few voters have a problem with that. But no to annual net immigration consistently 20 times greater and more. A strain on our infrastructure, public services and state finances is simply too much, testing Britain's natural tolerance to breaking point and beyond. That's just common sense, Allison. And even consensual public sector bean counters, desperate to maintain their last vestiges of credibility, are now risking the wrath of their dinner party chums by finally breaking cover. You've written on this subject, Allison, focusing on the dangers to women and girls posed by waves of illegal, often undocumented migrant men being housed at the heart of local communities. Linked to the column in Wednesday's Telegraph in the show notes to this episode. And I've been looking at the fiscal implications of waves of unskilled immigration. Again, link in the show notes. Meanwhile, our summer cheer's clouded as the prospect of yet more thumping tax rises in Rachel Reeves' autumn budget looms into view. And spare a thought for parents with kids at fee-paying schools, the vast majority of whom are by no means rich, the schools they support far from grand, given that next month marks the start of the first full school year, paying VAT on top of existing fees and on top of the taxes they already pay into the state's education coffers. It's enough to make you want to insult our dear Prime Minister, Allison, but mind how you go, because as Brits, according to the brilliant Twitter account Very British Problems, we specialise in insults that aren't quite swearing. The nation's favourite, we're told, is dipstick, closely followed by plonker, wally, and then wazzock. What's your insult of choice, dear mild-mannered co-pilot?
Can I just say, I mean, this may...
Muppet is number 5.
This may be a bit controversial, but I don't think dipstick is number 1.
Well, that's according to the brilliant ex-Twitter account, Very British Problems, dipstick. Yeah, it is popular. My kids say dipstick.
Oh, okay. So I'm a bit partial to numpty.
Numpty's a good one. You and Andrew Neil, he likes numpty, doesn't he?
I really like numpty, and that's basically the entire cabinet. Numpty plus number 8, plank.
Plank is good, yeah, plank. Plonker is, of course, Only Fools and Horses. It's lingering effect in our popular culture. Burke is good at number 6.
Pratt, which was my sort of generation at school, everyone was a Pratt.
Fallen out the top 10. And I must say, I lament the insult of my youth, dickhead.
Yes.
It's not there. An outrage.
I think that should be much, much closer to the top. But what we can't share with listeners your favourite insult, Halligan, because it is too rude.
It's a family show. The top 10 are dipstick, plonker, wally, wazzock, muppet, Burke, mug, plank, numpty, and finally, pillock.
Mug? Like Planet Normal mug?
No, a stupid mug.
Yeah.
He's some kind of mug, that guy.
Could be a bit of a cue for the poets, a stampede of poets. Do you feel a Bob the Bard, English traditional insults coming in? Go on, we're throwing it open to you, chaps.
And chapesses, because we like our female poets too.
Before we get on to this absolutely astonishing ongoing immigration saga, now I was thinking about the mystery of the 50 billion black hole. And earlier I was thinking, Liam, I actually quite regret you teaching me anything about economics.
Ignorance is bliss, that's what they say.
Because
How hard do you think it is for me, knowing all this stuff all the time?
Because I really preferred, every time I hear something now on the news, I think, that's not right. And before I would have not noticed it. So let's just recap. So Rachel turns up and announces there's a 22 billion black hole, which was the Tories had cruelly concealed from Labour, except I think it was the OBR pointed out it was basically in every written document that was there. But anyway, so the 22 billion black hole, which then Rachel in her October budget raised taxes by 45 billion and spending by 70 billion. But now, co-pilot, second best economist on the Planet Normal rocket, she needs another 50 billion.
How much?
Because there's a 50 billion black hole, which now this is the question, even though this year's borrowing will be 170 billion, what the bloody hell is this? Is this another ludicrous 50 billion black hole? I mean, they just make this stuff up. They say she's got to retain her £9 billion headroom. What, when we're already bankrupt? Just explain it to me.
So many numbers flying around.
Yeah.
So Labour came in July 24. They said, oh my God, there's a £22 billion black hole. We're going to have to raise taxes, even though we said we weren't going to raise taxes ahead of the election. Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, one of the best respected fiscal economists in the UK, said the so-called black hole was obvious to anyone who dared look. And that's a direct quote from somebody, he's no friend of the Conservatives or Reform by any means, ex-Treasury economist. What's actually happened now is that Labour upped taxes at the last budget in October 2024. They put taxes up by 40 billion a year and they put borrowing up by 30 billion a year. That's the 70 billion of extra spending that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And yet, as some of us said at the time, all it's done is driven the UK economy into a doom loop. And the doom loop is when you raise taxes in order to plug a so-called hole in your budget. But what you actually do is you hammer the economy, you hammer activity and entrepreneurship and enterprise, growth slows or goes negative as it currently is. And even though you've raised tax rates, you actually have less tax revenue and you have more benefit spending because there's more unemployment. So by raising taxes, rather than fixing the public finances, you actually make them much, much worse. And that's exactly what's happened over the last year. It is undeniably true. Nobody wants to admit it because Labour ideologically is predisposed to raising taxes. That's what makes their backbenchers get out of bed in the morning. They want to increase the size of the state as an end in itself rather than a means to an end of better living standards for ordinary people. And so we are going to have this madness of more tax rises in the autumn, which I predict will make the public finances not just worse, but a lot worse. And that's when the UK, unfortunately, it gives me no pleasure to say this, is going to get into proper trouble because once financial markets see what they suspect will happen, what I just said, actually is happening, higher tax rates lead to less tax revenue and weaker public finances, that's when they will start charging the UK government serious money to borrow. The UK government is already paying a higher rate of interest for long-term borrowing than any other major economy in the world, higher even than some of the previous crisis countries like Italy and Greece and Spain. And of course, because we have a big stock of outstanding debt and a lot of it is linked to inflation, as I've explained in previous Planet Normals, our debt service costs are now massive. We borrowed 148 billion in the last fiscal year. That's April 24 to April 25. 105 billion of that was debt interest. So that's where we are. And as for this endless media fixation on her fiscal rules are total nonsense.
Yeah.
Her fiscal rules, Allison, say that she has to have a current budget surplus in 5 years' time. And at the last budget, the OBR predicted that she'd have £10 billion of extra money at the end of this parliament, so 2029-30. The idea that you can forecast the public finances to within single or just into double-digit billions in 5 years' time is complete nonsense. And let me illustrate. Back in April 24, the OBR said borrowing by the government will be 80 billion. It turned out by April 25, that fiscal year, to be 148 billion. That's the magnitude of the forecasting error within 1 year. Almost, 70 billion pounds difference. And we're arguing about 10 billion pounds in 5 years' time. It's complete displacement activity. What we should be doing is looking at relentlessly cash flow, the amount of money we're spending on debt interest, the proportion of the money that the government's borrowing that's going on debt interest. Over the last fiscal year, 2/3 of the money the government was borrowing was going on paying the interest on its existing debt, completely unsustainable. And in the last month, for which we have figures in June, as we've mentioned already on Planet Normal, no less than 3/4 of the 20 odd billion the government borrowed in June alone, the biggest ever June borrowing total bar the depths of lockdown, 3/4 of that money, over 16 billion, went on debt interest on existing debt. Not paying off the existing debt, interest servicing the existing debt. This is what financial markets are worried about. This is why immigration is obviously a massive story at the moment. Israel-Palestine's a massive story. There's so much going on around the world. I would say for the UK, the most important thing in terms of impact on the living standards of our people over the next 6 to 12 months, on our economy, on our politics, is whether or not financial markets are going to carry on financing a Labour government that is now completely out to lunch when it comes to managing the public finances.
Well, I agree with you, except I would say that immigration was even Stevens, Liam. And let me tell you what I'm thinking now, which is that what you've just outlined is basically an emergency. We have a national emergency in immigration, absolutely incontrovertible now. And everywhere we look, the reaction, as with obsessing about whether Rachel Reeves can fill as a hole in my budget, absolute nonsense. In fact, I'm going to use my favourite insult, bollocks. Real, that wasn't in the top 10, was it? But absolute bollocks. And the other bollocks, let's be honest, is the other day we've now got reports coming in of alleged sexual assaults around the United Kingdom by asylum seekers, undocumented males who've broken into our country, living in hotels paid for by the British taxpayer. And the other day, when, these horrible stories were breaking, the BBC News led on the fact that it was going to be rather windy, right? There was going to be whatever it was, Storm Floris or Storm Joe Malone or whatever it was going to be. And I sat there and I just thought, we have descended into childishness and frivolity, haven't we? We've got this absolutely horrific, I would say, the stats that listeners will have heard you quoting at the top. What, a city the size of Sheffield arriving annually in a country that can't provide healthcare.
That's net. More people arrive, but of course you've got, a couple of 100,000 Brits emigrating each year.
Yeah.
But the net number is a city the size of Sheffield.
Yes, but where are they going to go? So let's just have a look at what's happened. So the latest YouGov poll found that 50% of British people want no more immigration, none at all, and 50% of the British people want immediate deportation for illegal migrants. So the political class, which has allowed reckless shifts in population, including allowing young, highly sexed males from cultures which have no respect for women. We've got thousands of Afghans brought into our country, Liam. Afghanistan only recently reintroduced stoning of women for adultery, right? They've got thousands of them living on an army base in Wiltshire. How is that compatible with the safety of women and girls in our country? Absolutely isn't. And then just to add, calm down, Allison, calm down. So just to add to the general fiasco, this week the government, clearly realising that public anger is spiralling out of control, moved away from stop the boats and smash the gangs and whichever pitiful mantra they've been wheeling out. So now, Liam, we've got one in, one out, a deal with France so stupid it makes the Rwanda scheme look like a surefire winner, right? So this is basically a surrender document in which France generously allows the British taxpayer to bribe her to take back maybe up to one of the 700 migrants who make the crossing in a single day. And then France then gets to send the UK a substitute asylum seeker. And I think we won't go far wrong, Halligan, if we assume that the asylum seeker France sends us is probably not going to be a software engineer or a brain surgeon. But just before I hand over to you, I want to tell listeners what this one in, one out deal comprises of, right? So are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Je suis prêt.
Yeah, je suis prêt. The UK, pays all transport and admin costs in both directions. France can veto any migrants we want to return. We can't cross-check fingerprints of the asylum seekers that France sends to us, and they won't run Eurodac checks for us on those men. We must process removals within 14 days of their arriving in Britain, or we lose the right to remove them. This is great. You're going to love this. Only about 50 migrants a week can be returned. That's barely 5% of the current numbers crossing the channel. Migrants, of course, can block their return to France using human rights appeals. And the UK, by contrast, must accept any asylum seekers chosen by France with no independent vetting. Even Keir Starmer's deal-making has plunged to new depths here. So not only, Liam, there's a tiny chance of anybody breaking into our country being deported, and keen-eyed listeners will see that, of course, it allows Labour to slyly open up a legal route into the UK while pretending it's a benefit for the British people.
It really does seem an incredibly lopsided, deeply inadequate deal. I've been thinking quite a lot over the last couple of days about the discussion I had with Nick Timothy a couple of weeks ago on Planet Normal, Allison, about how Labour is absolutely stymied. It can't consider third country processing, though I think that's where we're going. I think the political mood is shifting very, very rapidly now. And I think we can agree, if for me, the big issue facing us is the nerdiness of the government gilts market, and for you, the big issue is the safety of women and girls in the heartlands of our country. Immigration really is the issue that brings those two concerns together. And that's why these words by David Miles are so explosive. They're actually, as I explained on my When the Facts Change Substack, I wrote about it at length. And I've been writing about this in my Telegraph column a lot as well. David Miles is the ultimate public sector economist, and even he now, with all the weight of his office, he's, one of the top three guys at the OBR. He's by far and away seen as the most highly qualified and reputable economist at the OBR by a considerable margin. He's a very, very clever bloke, and he doesn't just say things off the top of his head. This will have been considered very, very seriously and have gone through many committees. He wrote an essay in a collection put together actually by Maurice Glassman and the Blue Labour movement. Just the fact that he's publishing with those guys is, quite political, if I may say so. I think that's good. I think our highly paid public servants should be getting out there and telling us what they really think at times of, significant national peril. And for him to be saying now, for him to be smashing up the sort of 20 or 30 year consensus that high immigration is good for the UK, it's good for fiscal policy, it's good for our paying pensions and so on. He is saying at the current pace, it's completely unsustainable. So, a lot of the dinner party classes are now going to have to say, David Miles, who runs the OBR, is part of the far right, right?
Yeah.
Which, of course, is completely preposterous. And that's why this is so interesting. And at the same time, you then have the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which I think is, when it comes to big picture macroeconomics, as opposed to the particular tax changes where the IFS is probably the most reputable. The National Institute, when it comes to big picture macroeconomic direction of the country really is second to none. This is, again, an absolutely establishment think tank. And for them to be preempting the OBR and saying, look, she has a really big problem here. She can't just keep raising taxes because she's going to end up with less tax revenue. It was previously 6 months ago, it was people like me saying that, and we were dismissed by the establishment as nutters, right? But now the establishment itself, very, very tame, superannuated, taxpayer-backed, gold-plated public sector pensioned economists are now saying this. It's not just lone intellectual gunmen. And they're saying it because they know financial markets are thinking it. And they have to try and maintain some kind of credibility. If they keep saying things that are patently nonsense, and expert observers and commentators can say they're patently nonsense, then these bodies lose all credibility. So they have to now start reflecting reality. And that's what they're doing, and not a moment too soon.
Another reputable body, the National Audit Office, has just predicted that within 10 years, the cost of asylum accommodation will reach 15.3 billion. Liam.
Over 10 years is absolutely huge. That's about triple the previous 10-year estimate.
I mean, we haven't got anywhere to put them. And I think what we're seeing now, we're getting loads of very interesting emails from listeners. We had one from a Planet Normal listener who's down in Wiltshire, very near a big army base there, who's saying it's absolutely full of these resettled Afghans, causing all sorts of tensions, not least that a squaddie who's been promoted and is now entitled to a 3-bedroom house is being told there isn't a 3-bedroom house in all of Wiltshire. So our own people, Liam, we're seeing that's one example of how our own people are being squeezed out of housing and leading to, obviously exacerbating tensions at a time when people haven't seen their pay go up and so on. And there's this scrabbling for public services. But it's very interesting to see as I said, the levels of denial going on in the mainstream media. We had on the BBC Radio 4 PM programme the other day, they were talking about this new data suggesting that illegal migrants and migrants in general actually are proportionately far more likely to commit sexual assaults. Now, I know someone at Migration Watch who told me that he'd had a very good conversation with the BBC reporter on the phone, where the BBC reporter said, yes, even if you factor age in, the age profile, it's still very clear that migrants are proportionately much more likely to sexually assault British women than men born in the United Kingdom. And the minute that interview started, the BBC stats guy was doing his absolute level best to totally discredit this highly legitimate data. Right, we're going to have a Velma stat. We haven't had one for a while.
Yes, I do.
For new listeners to Planet Normal,
this is Planet Normal Verify, okay? Not BBC Verify. This is Planet Normal Verify.
That's the co-pilot pretending to be Scooby-Doo, and I'm doing Velma in the orange roll neck with the thick spectacles. So here we are. Per capita rates for foreign nationals' sexual crime. Not one of our nicer Velma stats, but let's do it because I want to say this. So Afghans, 22 times more likely than British males to rape or sexually assault British women. Eritreans, 20 times. Namibians, 18 times. Albanians, 11 times. Somalians, 9 times. Bangladeshis, 4 times. Pakistanis, 3 times. And how many of them are we letting across the channel every day? It's outrageous, Liam. It's outrageous. It's not safe. And every other day now is some kid, some girl on the way home from school. Young British women are having to alter their behaviour to deal with the catcalling and the hissing. And that is just the low-level stuff I'm hearing about these guys hanging around children's playgrounds. A listener wrote to say that in Manchester, they were going into the women's toilets. I'm really, really upset about this now. And quite honestly, I think the British state, Whitehall, Westminster, the political class are personally responsible for every sexual attack that we now hear of on a British child. They want to arrest the people outside the migrant hotels protesting. I think we should be arresting the people who have imposed this on the British people.
I certainly think they're under enormous pressure. As we will remember, we've talked about it a lot on Planet Normal. In the aftermath of the Southport tragedy last summer, there was a sort of information vacuum. Nobody knew who this guy was. There were all kinds of rumours floating around that the police and the Home Office were very, very cagey about releasing data that was known about the suspect, who, of course, was rather quickly convicted of those horrendous murders of those little girls at the Taylor Swift dance class. You've now got Home Secretary Yvette Cooper maybe sort of trying to get ahead of the argument. Does she really mean it, though? I'd be interested in your view. Guidance for police on sharing the immigration status and ethnicity of crime suspects needs to change, the Home Secretary said last week, following calls for details to be released of two men charged over the alleged rape of a 12-year-old in Warwickshire. Yvette Cooper saying that we do need to see more transparency in cases. We think local people do need to have more information. But she's passing the buck when you look at the fine print of her statement, saying, oh, but it's up to the Crown Prosecution Service to decide what is released. So she's sort of preemptively recusing herself from decisions that may be awkward in terms of releasing information, which there's a public clamour to hear, but which could be pretty incendiary when it's released.
Well, clearly they do need greater transparency about this, but it's the CPS which refuses to collect the data on the ethnic profile of sex criminals, and we know why that is, don't we? Now, I think, Starmer this week just looking weaker and weaker as far as I'm concerned. He said, if you come here illegally on a small boat, you will face return. Well, it's not like you'll be chucked out on your ear, is it really, if you dare come here, but you will face return. More likely, you'll be handed a free phone and free accommodation, which we'll pinch from a soldier's family if we have to. Just to say, Liam, when they say they can't do anything about this invasion, which is what it is, Suella Braverman, you remember, was sacked from the cabinet for saying it was an invasion. We can't call it anything else now. It's up to 800 men breaking into the country every single day. But if we look across to other countries which are members of this ECHR, which is supposed to prevent us doing anything about this national emergency, Greece has set up secure camps to detain all illegal migrants for 3 months, and all of them will be denied the ability to claim asylum. The Greek migrants are being kept in containers with under-armed guard. Emergency legislation is allowing Greeks to circumvent the ECHR. And also we look at Denmark, like the other Scandinavian countries, particularly Sweden, which has seen horrific social problems arising from its migrant influx. So Denmark, another ECHR member, has almost closed its borders and is now using gated detention camps, some of them housing up to 2,000 migrants, and they are allowed out, Liam, for 2 hours a day and cannot work. So this shows, I would say to you, that if a government wants to protect its women and children, it can. Ours doesn't.
This week's guest is a long-term Planet Normal listener who emailed us at planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk, in this case about Labour's policy of charging VAT on school fees. Emma sends both her secondary school-aged children to a local independent school in southern England. We're being vague about the details to protect her privacy and that of her family. Emma and her husband run their own business, but they are by no means wealthy. They can only afford independent education, like many in their position, by going without expensive holidays, plush cars and other luxuries. Since Labour introduced 20% VAT on school fees in January this year, the fees Emma's household pay have risen significantly, despite efforts by the school to absorb as much of the cost as possible. Labour estimated 3,000 pupils would leave independent education due to the introduction of VAT, but numbers have already dropped 11,000 in England alone. And with many parents assessing their options over the summer, with the economy stalled and taxes set to rise more generally, a further exodus is expected in September, the start of the new school year. Far from raising £1.5 to £1.8 billion to spend on more state school teachers, as Labour predicted, falling pupil numbers mean the government's VAT raid could cost the state money, given the need to find more school places for growing numbers of independent school exiles. I started by asking Emma how VAT on school fees since January had impacted her children's school and the broader community.
Yes, well, I'm getting quite excised by quite a lot of things the government's doing, but yes, the VAT on private school fees is probably one that's closest to home. So I and my husband send our two children to the local private school in our small town. In terms of how it's affecting the community there, well, thankfully the school, from what they've said, and obviously I only know what I know is from being a parent, as it were, so I don't have any kind of inside information on the school, but they are quite transparent with talking to the parents about what this is doing to the school. They have tried every which way to make sure that they don't pass on the full 20%, which, I mean, of course, is now that they're meant to charge VAT means, of course, they can claim VAT back. So that does help in some ways. And so that's meant that our school fees haven't seen a ridiculous increase, although they have increased. It's now just under £10,000 for each term in the senior school.
And that's, of course, already out of your post-tax income that you and your husband
yes, I was going to say that's a lot of money to find out
Yeah.
of your net after you paid for everything else and done things. We have seen some friends of the children and kind of peer group, their parents deciding not to carry on. The school currently operates on a kind of middle school. So there's the kind of infant school, as in state terminology is the infant school, then the middle school, and then there's the senior school. So at those kind of two breaks, then you're seeing parents who are kind of sloughing off, as it were, into the state sector in the town, and from the middle school into the senior school is probably the key one, because that's where the fees do jump considerably. So my daughter is just going up into the senior school. Some of her year group are moving off into the state at that point. Thankfully, not many of her friends, so that's good for her, but obviously a lot of the children are in flux. And then my eldest is just starting in the lower sixth, and there has been quite a lot of people who have looked to schools. There's a large state sixth form college in one of the bigger towns near us, and that kind of pulls a lot of people there. Also, with them trying to think about Oxbridge and the perceived, whether it's true or not, that universities, Oxbridge and the like, now discriminate against private schooled kids at degree level. So trying to get into a state sixth form so that basically they look like they're state educated. It's disruptive,
to say the least. And you and your husband, you run your own business.
Yeah.
You're not rich by any means. You manage your household finances very, very carefully. You think, without going into too much detail, you think you can just about afford to keep your kids where they are. But it is, of course, a huge increase in the cost to you. And we know a lot of parents have decided that they just can't hack it anymore. And so we've seen far, far more kids leave to the state sector, around 13,000 and counting, than the government thought. We've seen dozens and dozens of schools closed. Now, some of those schools may closed anyway, but I know from my experience in the independent sector, governor of two schools, as I said, a lot of schools in our locality are under serious pressure when they weren't before. It seems to me, Emma, there's a triple whammy here. It's not just the VAT on school fees, which is impacting affordability for parents. It's also the lack of business rates relief for those independent schools as charities. And it's also the rise in national insurance contributions for employers, given that, you know, schools 70, 80% plus of their cost base is, of course, teachers' salaries and support staff salaries. And all this, of course, comes on top of COVID, when a lot of independent schools were mullered, frankly, because they had to keep teaching. Their teaching bill didn't go down, but they often gave parents a big break in fees, charging maybe half fees or something. And then, of course, something called the TPS, which all school governors know about, the Teachers' Pension Scheme, which has seen much, much bigger contributions by schools into those pension schemes of independent school teachers. So it seems like a perfect storm to me for independent schools. And of course, most independent schools aren't the big glitzy ones that are tremendously wealthy, you know, the Eatons and the Winchesters and so on. They are small businesses that often run with very, very small surpluses, and that surplus pretty much all goes back into the school.
Yeah, and they're mainly employing local people. Most of the teachers who work at the school are coming from the local area, the region. They're not coming from very far away. The school, it is lucky, yes, but it has lots of sports grounds. And so there's a whole team of estate and groundsmen, catering, all kinds of ancillary things. So, I mean, when we get vilified as private school children parents, as it were, for kind of somehow taking something away from the state side of things. I mean, at that point, I do start to lose the plot a bit, because instead of spending the money we spend every year on trying, giving our kids a really good, rich, varied education. And I know lots of people in our kind of circle of friends and the wider circle who don't send their kids to a private school, send them to state, and then spend thousands going off to Dubai twice a year or skiing and stuff. And my husband and I are putting money into the local economy, paying local teachers who are absolutely committed. And that's even before you get into all the kind of charity work the school does and everything he does to try and help the town and the community and the state schools in that community as well, in terms of their expertise and the facilities. There's a lot of clubs in the town that use the school's facilities of an evening and when they're not being used for the school. And, by the time we're paying the school fees at the start of every term, my husband and I have paid our taxes. We've absolutely done everything we can. And yes, we own our own business, so the buck stops with us, as it were. If we don't work, then there's no safety net really for us. If we don't work, we don't earn. So there's a lot of pressure on that side of things as well. The Telegraph had an article, I think, yesterday, and then one of the comments was basically that private school kids are taking things away from the state and it's a two-tier system and it's just not fair. What's not fair is that the state isn't taking examples like the Michaela School with Catherine Birbal Singh and saying, right, that's what all our state schools should be like. That's how we should be rolling it out. It's by not sending my two children to state school, I'm saving the government. Well, I think the government website had it cost of around about £7,500 per child per year is the cost that they put on educating. Well, that's £15,000 I'm not using, as it were, from the taxes that I've paid over to the government, and I'm allowing another child to have those two spaces. So I'm not taking anything away from the state at all, actually. And a lot of the kids that go to the school are from families who are, both parents are working. It may be that the grandparents are trying to support, I suppose.
Chipping in for the fees.
Yeah, exactly. So everyone's chipping in, as it were. And not because we all want to be kind of hooray Henrys and lord it over people, but, well, in my children's case, they're both very bright. They did fine at primary school, but they would rush through their work within, 10 minutes and then be sat in a corner reading a book. My daughter seemingly read all the books in the whole school, basically, because, she would finish and then be told to sit in the corner and read.
You went to state school yourself, didn't you, Emma, if I may say so? But your husband went to independent school.
Yeah, I went to the comprehensive in my hometown, yeah. And, gosh, it was fine. School for me at that point was just, I got through it and did my hobbies and stuff were my focus in my life at that point. It was absolutely fine. My husband was privately educated. We weren't wedded to sending the children private when they got to secondary school status.
But there was a certain amount of gamesmanship going on to access the limited state places in your town. People pretending to live at places, renting flats near the school, not even living there to get the residency. You guys weren't prepared to do that, right?
No, we weren't. There's a moral turpitude to that kind of attitude, which just... I can't really stomach. And I would sit in play dates and stuff with the children and the parents would be saying, oh, yes, well, I've got this great wheeze kind of thing. And I would just be thinking, how can you live with yourselves?
A lot of it goes on, doesn't it?
Of course
People
it does.
who
And
send their kids to state schools and are holier than thou, having wangled the place.
Of course, because often the only way to get into these outstanding state schools is either one of you's got to work there, so you get a kind of bunt in, or you've got a sibling there. But of course, that means that you get lots of people renting next to the school and banking, as it were, getting the first child in and bank all the rest, and then they disappear off to the nice village on the other side of the town kind of thing. Quite a few of the schools do aptitude tests, which is a limited place of around about 20 places in a year get given to languages or music, or one of the schools, it's an all-boys school that does sport, is very focused on that. So, you can try that route. But otherwise, yes, if you want to get in, basically you have to be camped on their front lawn.
Which, of course, means you're paying school fees by another route. Unless you do something nefarious, which a lot of parents do. I've seen it myself. The alternative is to buy a house in the school's tiny catchment area, which, of course, is far more expensive. So it's
because of the school,
it's sharp-elbowed, wealthier parents that get the places anyway.
Of course. Though people who have got money, and let's say they decide not to send their ones to private school because they do like to go to Dubai and wherever for their holidays and stuff, they're still putting their finger on the scales. They'll still be playing for private tuition out of school. They'll still be doing all the things you can do to just give your child that kind of breadth of education, which actually, I suppose my husband and I are just being a bit more upfront about and just saying, no, we'll pay the private school. They get music education, they get access to all kinds of sports, and they get to play it 3 times a week. They get access to people who have taught at a high level and are experts in the field. Let's just play it straight. We'll play with a straight bat and we will send it. But somehow in today's society, we're the bad guys. And that is enough to make me start swearing like a fisherwoman at times.
Go on, Emma.
Which
Go
I'll
on.
try not to do now.
Where do you think this is coming from? Clearly, this isn't going to raise a lot of money, because clearly an awful lot of people, and I think there's going to be a lot more to come, an awful lot of parents aren't going to be able to afford it. They're clinging on. They're waiting to see how the economy turns out over the summer and autumn. I do think there's going to be a further exodus from independent schools, but Labour seems to be pressing on regardless. Also pressing on with charging VAT on school fees when schools are dealing with special educational needs and so on. This is another big issue, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And there are quite a few parents who do have children who have got some form. And because, of course, the smaller class sizes in the private sector, and you get greater access to the teachers, so you can work much more closely with them about your child's needs. Absolutely, it is a draw. I mean, like I said, my children are both gifted in terms of academics, and they have always been challenged in the school. They're always told, excellent, well done, what else? And in state, unfortunately, they wouldn't be. And even in the really good schools, I know that a lot of the teachers, because they're dealing with large class sizes, it becomes about crowd control, and whoever's being the most disruptive is the one that rules the roost. And then my children sit twiddling their thumbs. Well, I know my son would have been really disruptive in those situations. He would have got bored, and then he would have just started being quite difficult, I would think, if he wasn't with teachers who first of all acknowledged his intelligence, but then said, well, good for you, crack on, what about it? But then you've got people like Catherine Birbalsingh who absolutely get that, I think.
You're talking about the Michaela School in Wembley in northwest London, a school I've visited. We've talked to Catherine a lot here on Planet Normal and beyond. This is a school that is obviously a state school. It's not a selective school.
No.
And yet the average A-level outcome for her sixth form is AAA.
Yeah.
That's the average. She's getting pupils into incredible schools, not just in the UK, but around the world in terms of universities. She's getting a higher percentage of 9s at GCSE than practically any school in the country, state or private, with a non-selective background. And yet Bridget Phillipson, for it is she, are astonishingly, in my view, anti-education secretary, pro-trade union education secretary to a T, is discrediting Catherine Birbalsingh, giving her a hard time.
Yeah, I know.
Absolutely
I mean, it's just
astonishing. It seems to me quite spiteful.
Yeah, when that all came out and she went to see her and then wrote that kind of open letter, Catherine did. Yeah, just astonishing that the government is not pointing to this woman and this school saying, okay, well, maybe it doesn't suit everyone, but this is what we can do.
Labour are legislating to make Michaela incapable of being Michaela. She's going to lose her so-called, under Labour's reforms, free school, academy school, freedoms for the head teacher to run recruitment, to manage his or her budget in the way they want to. It's absolutely mad. Finally, Emma, what's your message to this Labour government? There are some decent people in this government. Some of them came into politics for the right reasons. They think they're doing the right thing for kids.
Gosh, what would be my message? Yeah, that's a tricky one, Liam, actually. I think leave our kids alone, I think. Is that a Pink Floyd song?
It's certainly another brick in the wall. It's from the chorus, isn't it? Teacher, leave our kids alone.
That's
it's
the
Pink
one.
Floyd.
Yeah, Labour government, leave our kids alone. I would like them to put aside the sixth form politics and it is Marxist ideology, and to actually look at what is working and what the outcomes are, and to acknowledge that actually by paying for our children's education, we are not the bad guys, and actually working with private schools could actually help to take some of the strain off the state sector so that the state sector can reduce class sizes and it can start to work on improving outcomes for all the kids. Because after all, we all want that. I mean, nobody who sends their kid to private school is really thinking, well, good, we'll tread over the bodies of the state school pupils at all. We're all in a race to make sure that your child has the best possible outcome that you can give them. And in an ideal world, yes, if that was state, then all of us would send state. But the truth of the matter is it's not. And until the state starts to recognise that and actually starts to think of ways which actually emulates the private sector, gives that breadth of curriculum, emulates the Michaela School, then we're heading downhill. It's a race to the bottom, as it were, which all communist kind of situations do. It's always the race to the bottom. I mean, God, what would I say to the Labour government? You probably couldn't include it on the podcast, Liam.
Emma, it's great to talk to you. Thanks a lot for joining us on Planet Normal.
Thank you.
So there you go, Allison. That's Emma. We're keeping her identity under wraps in respect of privacy of her family and her kids. What I won't keep under wraps is that I'm actually a governor of 2 independent schools. And I can say for sure, I'm not talking about those schools in particular. I know the sector well. I am in touch with many, many school bursars across the country in my role as a governor and somebody who often speaks at conferences about independent education. As regular listeners will know, I won a scholarship to an independent school when I was aged 10, which was completely transformative for me and my life chances. And I can tell you from the horse's mouth, I'm hearing this across the sector, most independent schools are not wealthy at all. They've always run on small surpluses, which have been reinvested back into the school. They're not-for-profit organisations. They're charities. There aren't independent school fat cats per se. And independent schools were absolutely hammered during lockdown. They had to keep providing teaching online, of course, and yet many of them cut fees at least in half to give parents some kind of break. Independent schools, balance sheets, at least 70, often more than 80% of their costs are staff. Staff, of course, are now a lot more expensive given Labour's increase in national insurance for employers, given the increase in the minimum wage for many ancillary staff. So the wage bill's gone up hugely. A lot of independent schools have suffered because, as well as putting VAT on school fees, Labour is taking away what's called business rates relief from independent schools, which also undermines their balance sheet. Something else has been going on, which is called the TPS, the Teachers' Pension Scheme. Government has required independent schools to put much, much bigger contributions into teachers' pension funds, plus the economy generally, undermining the ability of parents to pay fees which are under a lot of pressure because, of course, schools' costs, and we haven't even mentioned electricity and gas bills for schools, absolutely huge, that are going through the roof. We are seeing the closure of dozens and dozens now of independent schools that, in my professional opinion, would not otherwise have closed had it not been VAT. And my concern is, by introducing this in January, Labour made it as difficult as they possibly could for the independent schools to manage it. A lot of us were having emergency board meetings literally in the middle of August when this information was leaked in a newspaper article that it would come in from the following January, sending letters to worried parents. We're now in a situation where parents are looking at their spreadsheets, looking at their family finances at the kitchen table, chewing the end of the proverbial pencil. The economy is looking bad. Business confidence is at its lowest ebb since COVID. The housing market is completely frozen in many parts of the country because of high stamp duty. Thanks to Labour for that. So a lot of families that would have to stretch themselves to provide independent education for their kids, which means most families who provide independent education for their kids, this could be a step too far. And I know a lot of schools are expecting a further exodus, people just not showing up in September who have got places because parents are so worried now about going into another full school year, getting on the hook for fees when the economy is looking so shaky and the tax burden looks only to be going up.
I thought Emma expressed the plight absolutely brilliantly, and things people don't understand really about private schools. I mean, obviously at the higher end, it's people, who money's no object, but there are lots of people like Emma and her family where it's scrimping and saving to put the money aside, because it isn't just academic children. Obviously, children like Emma's daughter, extremely bright, who, as she explained to you, was basically twiddling her thumbs at the back of the class in the state school, because they're often, not always, but there are schools where you've got exceptional teachers. But in many schools, that the most academically gifted children can't be accommodated very easily. And it's not just the academically gifted. There are private schools which offer very generous bursaries to extremely sporty children. And of course, many, many thousands of special educational needs children, again, who can't be accommodated within the state system because of the one-on-one attention that they need. So all benefiting hugely from this independent sector. And really, I mean, I share your disbelief and anger, Liam, because it is absolute mindless vandalism. And if we look at other countries, we know the Labour government very, very keen to worm their way back into the EU. But guess what? You can't. The EU forbids any taxing of education. So if we were back in the EU, they wouldn't be able to slap these fees on private education. And in fact, if we look around the world, my nieces, they're older now, but they grew up in Australia, where private education is incentivized.
You get a tax break, let alone a tax penalty.
Germany, many, many countries around the world where there are tax breaks, because of course it makes sense, doesn't it, to relieve the pressure on state schools, particularly coming back to our earlier theme about lots of immigrants coming in. So state schools could do with that kind of pressure being relieved. But what we're going to see instead is thousands of children pouring back into the state sector. And you know what, Liam, what's really shows how horrible, poisonous these socialists are is because it's all about safeguarding our children. They don't care if it's a child from a middle class background or what they see as posh, privileged background. It doesn't matter if they've got to be wrenched out of their school or away from their friends and teachers. No, that doesn't matter.
Having endured all the madness of COVID, of course.
Exactly.
Oh.
So children, many of our kids, as any parent will tell you, have, just kind of recovered from all that turmoil of COVID, and it doesn't matter now because they're all privileged. And we see, actually, just a related story, we see this kind of inability, not just class warfare, inability to do basic maths, coming back to our economics point. So we've had Lord Kinnock, former leader of the Labour Party, Neil Kinnock, who, by the way, I happen to know that his son, Stephen Kinnock, Labour MP, married, I think, to was she the Prime Minister of Denmark? So Stephen Kinnock's daughter was a pupil at the absolute private finishing school for the international elite, Atlantic College in Wales, an absolutely wonderful school. And good luck to the Kinnock's granddaughter for going to an absolutely first-rate, brilliant private school where she'll make connections that will set her up for life. But don't try and deny that to other people's children who haven't made millions on the EU gravy train as the Kinnocks have. But also Lord Kinnock now coming up with the brilliant suggestion of, increasing tax on private healthcare.
I don't know about Pillocks and Wazzocks and Wallies, but here's a bit of an economics lesson. There are things called merit goods that society wants to encourage. Health and education are absolutely at the top of that list. And there are things called demerit goods, tobacco and alcohol, which society doesn't want to encourage. An absolutely basic Stone Age principle of taxation is that you tax demerit goods and you don't tax merit goods. The Welsh windbag really needs to wind his neck in. The idea of actually taxing private healthcare, when that very use of private healthcare by cash-strapped families is taking pressure off a ridiculously bureaucratic NHS. It's moronic, and that would be in my top 10 list of insults that aren't quite swearing. Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
Unsurprisingly, Liam, we've had absolute shoals of emails this week about illegal migration and immigration. Lindsay says, an elderly friend of mine was attacked last year by a small boat migrant. The local police refused to arrest him, tried to downgrade the crime to attempted car theft, and when they finally arrested and charged him, he told the police he hates women. We've been told there is a very thick file on this individual and he's on remand somewhere. The alleged cover-ups are everywhere. Lots and lots of examples, Liam, of assaults. This is from Harriet. A 15-year-old family member was assaulted on a bus. It was caught on CCTV and the CPS said not enough proof. The police sent someone to interview the 15-year-old girl. Kent police were not doing anything until I put a carefully worded post on Facebook and X and refused to take it down until they arrested the migrant. The girl had got a pic on her phone, he was on CCTV, and we knew exactly where he lived. He did spend 2 nights at Her Majesty's pleasure and then released to stay out of Kent, of course. When bail released, he was able to return. There was a very similar identity of a man looking just like him who had assaulted a woman the week before in exactly the same area. Nothing done to my knowledge. When I was told my post could inflame racial tensions, I replied that I didn't care. I was more worried for young women and girls, including the ones in the same migrant hotel receptions area, says Harriet. Why, as a nation, are we unable to challenge criminal behaviour from certain illegal groups is beyond me. There is an incompatibility beyond the social norms of this country and those of these irregular, quote-unquote, migrants. And until we sort it out, we are helping nobody. And finally, a short one from Helen, Liam. It's very clear to me that our government doesn't give 2 hoots about our daughters. It is depressing and incredibly alarming. I have advised both my daughters, who are high achievers in their 20s, to strongly consider living and working in a different Western country, as I truly fear for their safety in the UK. How has it come to this? Asked Helen.
This is from Wendy, Allison. It's impossible for any nation to absorb the runaway population growth now manifesting here. This is a result of the consequence-free magical thinking which has replaced common sense and popular consent. Net zero constraints are converging with population pressure on a scale never seen before, ignored by our establishment, whose movers and shakers seem to have retreated to la-la land. It's a recipe for disaster, civil unrest, rising tensions, says Wendy, increased rationing, suppression of basic freedoms hitherto widely accepted. The signs are there, the evidence for all to see. I worked for the Home Office for 5 years, says Wendy. I do know what I'm talking about. And this is Mary, these legions of fit. And we should say, Allison, we're reflecting our post bag here, right? We're not picking out the ones about immigration. We've had an absolute tsunami of emails about this.
We have, and I think people will, when you read out Mary's, I think the listeners will hear that these are nothing to do with racism. These are people responding to what now is a national emergency.
These legions of fit young men crossing the channel completely invert the image of refugees throughout histories, of families, men and older men with children, bundled burdens on their backs, loaded into prams and wheelbarrows piled high on some clapped-out vehicle. Often the younger men have stayed back to fight. This is not what we've been witnessing now, and it makes the claims of any to be refugees highly suspicious, says Mary. And Ben, at some point soon there's going to be an eruption that will make last summer's riots seem like a picnic. Shame on this government and the last one. It's an utter shambles. We need to leave the ECHR, that's the European Convention on Human Rights, which you were discussing earlier, Allison, now, says Ben, and sticks what's left of the Royal Navy in the Channel and make them turn around every boatload of people back to France. Emotions clearly riding very high, Allison. And it strikes me now, leaving the ECHR is becoming an absolutely mainstream political point of view. And I think that's changed just in the last few months. And it's interesting when you think, I was looking back at some old news stories, under Blair, under President Obama in the States, there were loads of deportations going on. Loads of deportations, far more than under centre-right parties. What's happened, the difference is, particularly in Europe, is that the judges and the lawyers and the kind of legal aid industry has just become so much more activist than it previously was. And this is the problem with the ECHR. It's being used now to extend law into areas that it shouldn't go into, or certainly the original convention wasn't designed for it to go into. And I do think now that reining in activist lawyers in this area so elected politicians can do what they've been elected to do and what the public clearly wants, that is able to happen. And until it happens, I think there's just going to be ever more frustration and ever more tension.
I think a lot of people now feel, people don't want to be over sensational, but it does feel like we're coming to some breaking point. And in my darkest moments, Liam, I think we're one child murder away from serious unrest. And I began my column this week with a story about a lovely guy called John, who comes to help me in the garden with all the jobs I can't quite manage. And John is one of those absolute backbone of Britain, gentle, decent, very hardworking types. And he's very worried about his teenage daughter who has to walk to school past an RAF base where there are hundreds of illegal migrants, and the girls have been told to alter their journey to avoid catcalling and hissing and God knows what. And John said the other day, we were talking in the pub the other night and we agreed that it was going to be, in the end, it was going to come down to men like us to go down and defend our southern border. Imagine that, Liam. Imagine that, right? Just honest, hardworking, best of British type of guy saying, me and the lads are going to have to go down and defend our southern border. Absolutely astonishing to let it get to that kind of level of where people wrongly, I believe, I must say this, I don't want people to take it into their own hands. I think we should be able to resolve this situation through democracy and through decided action to put the safety of the British people first.
And on that rather somber note, Allison, that's it from Planet Normal for another week as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reasoned views. Email of the week, it's my turn, and I'm going to give the email of the week to Wendy. So Wendy, email us at planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk, send us your postal address, put in the subject heading mug winner, and we will send a Planet Normal mug to you.
I just want to say, I didn't mention it earlier, but when you said nutter, I thought, now, there we are. There's a favourite, Cope. There's a favourite.
There's a top 10 non-swear word insult, isn't there?
Nutter numpty. The entire Labour front bench. There we go.
Some housekeeping.
Yes.
This is our last regular episode of Planet Normal before our summer break, our well-earned summer break. Allison and I will be back on Thursday, the 4th of September. But in the meantime, in between time, we will be releasing every Thursday morning between now and the 4th of September, a Planet Normal excerpt special where the Planet Normal team will be bringing you a selection of our favourite interviews throughout the year with some of our astonishing Planet Normal guests.
We'll miss you all, so please do write in anything that strikes you over the summer holidays and, of course, your favourite insult for co-pilot Halligan.
And we will, of course, miss each other, won't we, Allison?
We will.
A bit.
We will.
A bit. And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal and the madness of Planet Earth comes back into view, thanks as ever to our producers, Cass Ho, James Hodgson, Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
Wazzock.
Yay!